Hello. Hey, lovely to be. Very quick, in case you're not sure who I am, I'm a teacher at St. Peter's in Cambridge, and so I teach religious education. And one of the courses we do is on church history. So it kind of gelled out well that I could kind of slip into this. It's gonna be a pretty broad topic today. About 1,000 years we're covering. So from the years about 600 to 1500. So I'm not gonna spend too much time introducing myself. We'll just kind of jump straight into it. Here's kind of my key points that I want to look at today: the Great Schism, the Crusades, a guy called Pope Innocent III, very much not innocent, doctrinal decay. So kind of the things that start to creep into the church that very much sets up for us the Roman Catholic Church today. And then our pre-reformers, Wycliffe and Huss, if we have time at the end. Kind of setting up for next week when we look at the Reformation. Very quick bit of context, just to see where we are at in history. So Constantine and Licinius. Constantine became a Christian. He was a Roman emperor in the West. And he signed what's called the Edict of Milan with his friend Licinius, legalizing Christianity. So Christianity was a persecuted religion. Now it's allowed in the Roman Empire. They can build churches, they get their goods that were confiscated, given back to them. Funnily enough, Licinius ends up going back on his word and persecuting Christians again, and then Constantine wipes them out. And then a little bit later, they sign the Edict of Thessalonica, which makes Christianity the official state religion. 476, Germanic forces from Northern Europe come through and they conquer the Western Roman Empire, and then the Roman Empire continues to exist in the east, where modern-day Turkey is, as the Byzantine Empire. 610, the Prophet Muhammad receives his first revelations from the angel Gabriel, according to Muslim teaching, and kind of the religion of Islam is kind of born at that point. And in 800, Pope Leo III crowns a guy called Charlemagne as Roman emperor, making the Holy Roman Empire, which is separate to the original Roman Empire. It's kind of like a copy of what I guess they're trying to lay claim to the land and kind of make it sound like it was something cool, but it wasn't. It wasn't holy, nor Roman, nor was it an empire. So the Great Schism. So here's a map of what would end up being the Great Schism, the lines that are drawn. It's very much felt to this day, the effects of what happened here in the Great Schism. We'll see in a second that these lines between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox today pretty much still exist in the same places. Before the schism between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, Christianity was pretty unified up until this point. There are a few fringe groups that kind of get squashed here and there, but pretty unified. But over time, a few different differences develop in different areas within the church. Here's some key ones. The Filioque controversy. We'll look at that in a second. Probably never heard that word before. We'll never use it again. Some of the differences that we have kind of starting to bubble and arise because they're very far apart from each other, right? And they don't really talk much, and so they start to develop their own distinctives, which become points of contention later on. Catholics have decided that if you're a priest, you're going to be celibate. Orthodoxy rejects that. Catholics use unleavened bread, trying to be, I guess, more biblical. Orthodoxy use leavened, and of course there's a Latin and Greek language difference too. Here is the Filioque controversy. This is the Nicene Creed. So this was signed 300s sometime, and this is kind of one of the original creeds that the church came together, one of the first kind of ecumenical councils. All the churches around the world came together, and they put this together. However, in the original, you can see that little red circle there, and the sun. In Greek, or Latin, filioque, that's that one word. And so what the Roman Catholics did is they added that into the Nicene Creed, because they were there was a heresy called Arianism that was kind of on the rise, and they wanted to kind of make sure there was no doubt that Arianism could ever get back in. So they add this phrase, and the Son. So whoever believes in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and Son. With the Father and the Son, he is worshipped and glorified. However, the Orthodox, they were pretty upset that these guys went and tampered with this kind of historical document, and they thought they had their own theological reasons for that. And pretty much this puts kind of the linchpin, I guess, in what would become the Great Schism. So here's our lines there. By the way, I don't actually really know what difference it actually makes. It seems like such a minor difference. Brad might have some theological insight, but it seems pretty random for me. Here's our lines. So at this time, in 1054, Pope Leo IX is in power, and we have the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius. So eventually, the Pope, the Middle Ages is a time where the Pope kind of starts to see or kind of realize how powerful the role really is. He starts to kind of consolidate that power and start to flex it a little bit. And the Pope eventually would come to say, being in the seat of St. Peter himself, to whom the keys were given, he says, I claim authority over all churches. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, has the God-given divine right to be the head of all the churches. And understandably, the rest of the churches say, on the East, they say, actually, no thanks, we would rather just remain our own independent thing. To which the Bishop of Rome says, you're excommunicated. They have a guy, Cardinal Humbert. He goes to Constantinople, to the Hagia Sophia, and a dramatic kind of lays the excommunication bull on the temple altar, and officially kicks out the whole eastern side from the church. And by excommunicating, you're pretty much saying you guys aren't Christians anymore. They weren't allowed to administer sacraments, which for Catholics was a big thing, and they weren't recognised as Christians anymore. And of course, they respond by actually saying, well, actually, no, you're excommunicated from the church. And so we have our Great Schism branching the two. It's pretty hard to, it's one of those things that was bubbling for a long time. So it's pretty hard to pin it down to one event that happened. But that's the broad kind of quick history of how I guess we got to Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. Which, as you can see in this picture here, if you compare the two, kind of get your head right where everything is, the distinctions still pretty much exist today in terms of predominant Christian denomination that's existing in those areas. Super quick side note, if you ever look up church history timeline, I do this often for my job, I guess, but you'll notice they all kind of look the same. Here's a blown up picture. For some reason, the Eastern Orthodox Church loves to put out these timelines, and I think they're just really trying to prove their point that they're like the one true church, and they always had the Roman Catholic Church branching off. So if you ever see a church timeline, we can trace it back to this Great Schism, I guess. So one of the more controversial parts of the Middle Ages, sorry, we are just beaming through, is the Crusades. So kind of the pretext of the Crusades is when Islam first came on the scene, it grew very, very quick. Within about 200 years, Islam had kind of taken over this amount of land. huge expansion. And during this time, during the Middle Ages, the pilgrimage business had become very big. And Christians, if you're a Christian living in Europe, where do you think would be a really cool place to go on pilgrimage? Israel. Anywhere particular in Israel? Jerusalem, yep. So Christians would quite often pilgrimage to Jerusalem thinking it would give them some type of spiritual benefit of some sort. You know, God would be like, wow, look at you. You did this for me. And then reward them somehow, I guess. But if you know your history and we look at this map, you'd see that Jerusalem has actually been under Muslim control for a very long time. And Christians, Muslims, Jews, they existed pretty peacefully for the longest time. Christians just weren't allowed, they could come and they could give them their money, and they can, as long as they don't build their churches there, or they don't try to convert anyone, you're welcome. So Christians, Muslims, Jews, for the first part, actually get along pretty well. It wasn't until a group called the Seljuks, Seljuk Turks, they come through, they adopt Islam on their way through, and they take a much more kind of aggressive approach, I guess. And they decide that they want to actually start expanding into Christian territory. And the Christians that are in Jerusalem, they kick out, they start persecuting, and they say, sorry, you're not welcome here. So this raises an issue for our Byzantines, our Eastern Roman Empire, our Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople. And a kind of I knew you would be back moment for the Pope. The Byzantines ask the Pope for some help. They say, hey, you know, we're still kind of friends, right? Like, can you lend us a hand and help us get rid of these Muslims that are kind of coming in? And the Pope thinks, who's Pope Urban II at the time, he thinks, okay, like maybe this is the chance I can pull us all back together. You know, they'll see, I'll go and save them, and then they'll realize once and for all that I am the guy on top, and that they'll fall in line. And so, the first crusade is launched. There's 9 crusades all up that happen, and there's multiple little ones. There's even one where they send. Oh, I'll talk about that in a second. I won't get distracted. So the Crusades, essentially, the Pope rallies together Christian countries and Christian laity, you know, just random Christian people, under the banner saying, God wills it, he says. God wills it to go to war. We're going to defeat these Muslim infidels. We're going to retake the Holy Land for Christianity once and for all. Which is pretty unprecedented for the time, right? You know, you think back 3 weeks ago, we had this small persecuted church that was in hiding, and then it becomes legal. And now all of a sudden the church is calling armies and actually conquering land. So something pretty significant has changed in this time. So Pope gets people together and they march on to Jerusalem and they win. They conquer it and they rule there for a couple decades. And yeah, so they're pretty happy. They, you know, in their mind they think, yeah, God did will it. Like, we went in there, we did business, and we got it. However, a little while later, they do lose Jerusalem again, and they go for a second time, but it's a humiliating defeat. I think pretty much just poor communication. They kind of gets rushed in, and they never actually properly make it there. Then we have our third crusade. Which is our kind of romanticized crusade that we think of. Has our all-star cast, Richard Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire. they actually get together. They do retake the Holy Land against, you guys might have heard of Saladin. He's the kind of Muslim commander at the time. Big fights, and they do manage to conquer quite a few cities in Israel, but they don't quite make it to Jerusalem. And it's during this time that we get stories of guys like Robin Hood. If you know King Richard, his brother was King John, who was back in England at the time, looking after the place, but he's a very cruel guy, and so Robin Hood was stealing from the rich to give to the poor that were being neglected under John. So the Fourth Crusade is my favourite crusade. The title there makes it look a little bit grim. So here's a very quick run through of what happens in our Fourth Crusade. So the Pope, this is Pope Innocent III by now, who we'll look at in a second. He decides, okay, it's time to have a go again at getting back Jerusalem. And so he calls for a crusade, and they devise this plan instead of walking. So normally they'd walk right around. They'd go from Rome, walk right around through Constantinople, and then into Jerusalem. They thought, we could save a lot of time if we just sail. So they gather all the crusaders together in Venice. And so they make a deal with the Venetians. They say, we'll give you a certain amount of boats, and you can go sail there. However, not enough crusaders show up, and so they've got this massive surplus of boats that they can't pay for. And so the Venetians, thinking, very savvy business people over there, they say, okay, I got a picture with it. They say, we want you to go take out the city of Zara. They're causing, they're a bit of business rivalry. They're causing a bit of issues for them. There's Zara, about where it is on the map. They say, go take out Zara for us, and then we'll give you a discount on the boats so you can afford it. Not quite free, but a discount. And so the Crusaders go, oops, spoiler. The Crusaders go and they take the city of Zara. The tricky thing, though, was that Zara was a Christian city. Zara were Christians under the empire. So, from my understanding, the Pope actually at this point excommunicates the Crusaders. So, hey, you just went and killed a pile of Christians. For what? I'm kicking you out of the church. And he kicks the entire city of Venice out of the church as well, for a time. So, the Crusaders are left in Zara. They're excommunicated from the church. But their thinking is, hey, if we can go get Jerusalem, Pope will like us again. And so they're pretty resolved. They're like, we're going to do it. We're going to do what we set out to do. And they get a really tempting offer from a guy called, I think it's Alexius IV, who is want to be emperor in Constantinople. And he says, hey, you come over to Constantinople. So at this point, they're just in Zara, just waiting. He says, you come out of Constantinople, you help me retake my throne, and then I will support you in the war. I'll give you all the money you need, all the soldiers, anything you need, and we'll go take it together. And they think, okay, that's a pretty good deal. So and here he is, there's Alexius IV. They travel to Constantinople, and they ransack it. They completely siege it, and they take over Constantinople. The issue is, Alexius IV doesn't actually have any money to give them, and he's got no resources to give them. So what happens after a time, the Crusaders, keep knocking on his door, kind of asking him to fess up. Over time, he just can't, and he tries to lock them out, and the Crusaders come in and depose him and ransack Constantinople again, and they establish what is called the Latin Kingdom. And that's the end of the crusade. They never even make it to Jerusalem. All they end up achieving was killing more Christians. So it was a complete failure. Interestingly enough, it's somewhat historically significant because this pretty much puts an end to the Byzantine Empire and it weakens it to such extent that the Ottomans later come on in. And we know the Ottomans end up, if we can real connect it to today, the Ottomans come in, they take over. The Ottomans would later in history join the Central Powers, and the Ottomans would take the Palestine region. They'd join the Central Powers, they would lose that war, Britain would take the Palestine region off them and then give it to the UN, and then we get Israel. So it all kind of ties back to these things, right? This Fourth Crusade didn't happen. Even that might have looked slightly different, I guess. Here's a guy I mentioned before. By the way, if there's any questions or anything, please do feel free to ask. Sorry that it is pretty speedy through. Feel free to slow me down. So Pope Innocent III, he's pretty well known for kind of being the guy who takes the church, the Roman Catholic Church, to its fullest extent in terms of its earthly and spiritual authority. He develops this theory called the sun and moon theory, or the two swords. So he says the Pope is like a spiritual sword, represented by the sun, and that the Pope has supreme authority over all Christians, and was ultimately the one keenly responsible for their salvation. And so the moon, which is the physical or the temporal sword, is people like kings, rulers, different emperors, authorities, and they have charge by God over earthly or temporal matters. But in Pope Innocent's kind of analogy there, the sun is brighter than the moon, and the sun actually has authority over the temporal authorities as well. So that, if there's a debate or issue, the Pope actually comes first. He's the guy who's in charge at the end of the day. There's a document called the Donation of Constantine, in which Constantine says, "I give the western half of my empire to the Pope," declaring the Pope as universal bishop and the highest and chief of all priests in the whole world. The issue with that document is that it was written sometime in the year 800, around 400 years after Constantine, and was almost definitely not actually Constantine's words. So it's a bit of a pretty dodgy thing to stake on. But yeah, he's pretty much saying, I'm in charge of everyone. And people fall in line, actually. And he uses his authority. So, two very quick examples. There's a guy called Otto IV. Innocent is very tactical in that when Otto IV is becoming emperor, he says, I'll be the guy there, and I'll be the guy who puts the crown on his head. And so it becomes very symbolic that, hey, I'm the guy who makes emperors. Otto IV wasn't very happy about that. And so he acted up a little bit. And then Innocent, when he was unhappy with him, said, okay, you're gone. And he supports kind of a coup to get Frederick II in. So he has the ability to do that. Otto IV gets on his bad side. He says, you're out. Which again, when we think about our development of the church, is pretty crazy now that our church leaders that were persecuted can now decide who gets to be king and emperor. And then we have King John of England. Here's the picture of King John, if you remember. So King John of England gets into a bit of a spat with Innocent III, and Innocent III says, hey, I want you to put this guy as the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is kind of the highest religious seat in England. And King John says, nah, actually, I don't think I want that guy there. And so the Pope ends up kicking out the entire country of England out of the church. He excommunicates all of them, meaning that they're legally not allowed to do sacraments in the whole country. And so King John's kind of hands are tied, and he says, okay. And he actually declares England a fief, he submits the whole rule of England under the Pope at that point. So Pope Innocent's pretty powerful. Like, he can do some pretty crazy stuff. And he wasn't scared to flex that authority on people. What's our time? Is there any questions on that? Sorry, yeah. You can read the book afterwards if you. So there's a section in your book that, to be honest, those first two parts were kind of little sub-notes that I've just kind of picked on. I find them interesting myself. On page 21, there's a section called Doctrinal Decay and Seeds of... So, in the late Middle Ages, it's kind of a time period from about 1100s onwards. The Catholic Church starts to really get into its groove, and it starts to really figure out what makes it distinct. And people like Pope Innocent is very involved in kind of solidifying church doctrine. And one of the doctrines that forms during this time in the late Middle Ages is an idea called Mariology. So we're talking about Mary, the mother of Jesus here. Catholics developed this idea that Mary, being like the ultimate example of a saint, I guess, Mary, the mother of Jesus, you can essentially pray to her, and she will take your prayers, pray for you before God. Understanding that it's almost like, our prayers are pretty like subpar. You appeal to Mary, she's got really awesome prayers. Like she'll hook you up real good. Like if you can get Mary on your side. So she's given this title mediatrix, essentially meaning that no longer was it, Jesus being the only mediator between us and God. Now Mary's in there as well. So you can pray to Mary or Jesus kind of thing. And so the kind of image is that she's there interceding. She hears our prayers and she intercedes for us. She's also given the title Queen of Heaven. And you might have heard of the Rosary and Hail Marys. Rosary, the little beads they go through. There's this little prayer as part of the Rosary called the Hail Mary that they pray a couple times. A few other quick things. They believe that she was immaculately conceived. So what that means is that Mary's she was born without sin. She was sinless when she was conceived and when she was born. And so, at the moment of conception, immaculate, no sin. And that was to her parents, Saint Joachim and Anne. Anyone remember in the Bible where we see Saint Joachim and Anne? Bible trivia for you. It's actually not in the Bible. It's from it's called the Gospel of James. So it's a secondary document that the Catholic Church uses. And that's where they get these ideas. It's all in there that we get these ideas about who her parents were. Seems to borrow a lot from Samuel's story. But also in there, we get the idea of Mary's perpetual virginity. So Catholics teach that Mary always was a virgin, and that the question for us then is who were James and Jesus' brothers? It's pretty clear that Jesus had some brothers. How they dance around that is they say that Joseph had a previous marriage and had children. So they were Jesus. I don't even know if you can consider them as brothers, like by blood at all. I don't know. But brothers in terms of his family. Uh, we're kind of just glossing over these, but in fairness to our Catholic friends, they often get attacked for like worshipping Mary. They themselves, although we could kind of argue practically they are kind of doing that, they themselves would not say that they're worshipping Mary. Mary rather is just kind of the ultimate example of what a saint looks like. It's a person who we can base our lives after, and someone who we can pray to intercede for us. The ultimate example of faith, humility, and obedience. But they would never claim that they worship her. That's only for Jesus. So, just in fairness to them. Another idea is idea of transubstantiation. So this is another big word. This is the idea that for Catholics, when they take communion, or they call it the Eucharist, when you take the bread and wine, it literally becomes Christ, once it's consecrated, so the priest will consecrate it and pray over it. At that point, it literally becomes Christ's body and blood. The key here, though, I think it's, because I remember hearing about this when I was younger. I was thinking, it doesn't look like Christ's body, it doesn't smell like Christ's blood. And I remember reading, like someone did a report, Catholic ate it, and then they took it back out to test it, and it was still bread and wine. But how they explain it is that it gets back into Greek philosophy, I guess, but that although the physical properties of the bread and wine remain the same, so it still looks like bread, tastes like bread, smells like bread, has a nutritional value of bread, it substantively becomes Christ's body and blood, which is it's kind of a tricky thing to kind of explain the distinction there. Although it looks, tastes, smells like bread and wine, it very much truly is Christ's body and blood. By contrast, and I hope I'm right in saying this, we would view the bread and wine, or the grape juices we have it here, to be symbolic emblems of Christ's body and blood. And we partake in communion not to receive Christ, but in that real, tangible, substantive way, but as a way of remembering and reflecting on Christ's work on the cross. There's a nod there, so that's good. Penance. So Catholics have this idea. So these are all doctrines that are developing during this time in the Middle Ages. These are things that they're starting to formulate and put into official church doctrine. Some kind of scholars would say that it's during this time period that the Catholic Church actually begins to be the Catholic Church. Catholics hate people saying that because they like to think they've always had these things, but that's during this time that these new, more radical doctrinal distinctives start to form. So penance, first off, important to note, in the Catholic teaching, baptism, the point of baptism is to forgive original sin and any sin that has occurred previously before that. So, hence why when a baby's born, quickly baptize them, get rid of that original sin. Get it out of there, don't worry about it. But it still raises an issue about what happens for sin that happens afterwards. Into penance. So Catholics do something called penance, which is kind of different acts, things that they can do as a way of restoring themselves or removing sin in their life. Practically, this looks like visiting a priest, going to confession, the sacrament of confession they call it, and then the priest will absolve and forgive the sin, and then will assign some act of penance to do, which could be, say, a certain prayer, do 6 Hail Marys, or it might even include that person having to go to the wronged party at doing something to forgive that. So there's our idea of penance. And by contrast, we here would say that forgiveness of sin is not done by any works that we can do. There's nothing we do to earn forgiveness of sin. It's all a complete finished work of Christ on the cross that we receive by grace through faith alone, in Christ alone. And a doctrinal distinctive, I guess, of this church would be that we're all priests. We don't need a priest to step into that process. We're all priests, the priesthood of all believers. Any of us can go to each other and confess our sin and receive forgiveness. Any questions?
Presumably these all came in because the Roman Catholic Church was bringing in because of the infallibility of the Pope. So therefore, stuff wasn't questioned or didn't have to go back to any reference point, only the Pope.
Yeah, a lot of them are decided at like councils. They get together, that the Pope will call, but then it's kind of, if the Pope says, he'll be like, let's all get together and decide this together. But it's pretty much the Pope just telling everyone else what's going to happen. This is ideas that come through the Pope, pretty much. Another idea that ties in closely with this is the idea of purgatory. So Catholics have this teaching that there is an intermediate state between heaven and earth where we are purged from our sins. My understanding is that non-Christians don't go to purgatory. They would go straight to hell. But if you're a Christian and there's a little bit of sin still kind of lurking in your life, things that you didn't kind of absolve through penance, you go to this place called purgatory. And you spend a certain amount of time there, could be a very long time, working off that sin. I don't quite know what that working off looks like, but we go to purgatory. I think, here's Pope Innocent IV. So Pope Innocent III is, don't worry about the names. It's just another Pope Innocent. He describes, he's the guy who brings in purgatory as official doctrine. A temporary fire where sins which could not be previously forgiven through penance are purged. That temporary fire there kind of insinuates that it's not like a happy place to go to purgatory. It's going to be painful, whatever that process of paying for those sins. An idea that comes in through this idea of purgatory is the idea of praying for the dead. So Catholic teaching would say that if you have friends or family in purgatory, currently paying off their penance, you can pray for them and you can kind of help them along in their journey. You can kind of impart some type of spiritual merit onto them, and it will reduce their time that they spend in purgatory. I was looking at a forum thread online, and they were talking about, as a Catholic guy asking about a friend of his that died, and he was asking where is he, and pretty much every response just said pray for him, pray for him, pray for him, which is so different to kind of how we would approach that from our kind of theological perspective about what the efficacy of prayer for dead people. But Brad can probably talk about that at some point. So if you're onto it, you'll notice that what a lot of these doctrines are doing are kind of replacing Christ, the Christ-centric nature of what we believe Christianity is. No longer is it just salvation through Christ alone. They're adding in all these different hurdles and steps along the way, kind of centralizing it into something that we can do, which I guess we shouldn't be surprised at. Finally, where things get really bad, all of that was pretty bad, but things get really bad, is the idea of indulgences. So Catholic Church brought in this idea that you could receive something called an indulgence. And receiving that indulgence would, depending on the level of how much it was, could reduce the amount of time you would spend in purgatory in future. So if you, it's pretty much like a, insurance policy, I guess. You don't know how long you spend in purgatory, quickly get some indulgences, and you're gonna get reduced time. And the Pope was the person who was able to administer these. Some of the later crusades, what the Pope actually did to mobilize people would say, if you fight in the crusade for me, I'll give you an indulgence, and that will sometimes actually give an indulgences that would cut the time in purgatory completely, which is a pretty tempting offer. If you go fight the crusade, you die a martyr, your time in purgatory is cut, you get to go straight to heaven. So pretty good offer. Indulgences in Catholic theology can be given for living and dead. So as we'll see in the Reformation period, it was kind of a marketing technique that people would use to say, hey, don't you really, do you even love your people, your family members that have died? If you really love them, surely you could spare a bit of change to buy an indulgence for them. So it gets pretty nasty tactics. Martin Luther ends up having a quote saying, pretty much, if the Pope is really that loving and he's able to, why doesn't he just give everyone indulgences? Why doesn't he just cut purgatory? If the Pope can do that, why doesn't he just do it for everyone? Which I think is a pretty strong point. I don't know how the Pope ever replied to that. Interestingly, there's still practice today, because as we'll see in the Reformation time, the church actually started selling the indulgences for money. But after the Reformation, the Catholic Church kind of responds to that, and they stop selling indulgences. So indulgences are still offered today, but it's usually for some act of charity or some act of showing your devotion in some way. Not sold for money anymore. So the kind of thing that Luther kind of really was against in terms of how it was being practiced initially, they don't do that anymore. So that did change. Very quickly, the last 5 minutes I have, two guys, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. It wasn't all bad during this time. I realize it's a pretty grim picture that's been presented so far of this time period for the church. There were some good guys. There's a guy called John Wycliffe, who was English, and he's often called the morning star of the Reformation. He's kind of one of the first guys we have to point to that starts teaching and putting out ideas that we would see as Reformation values, arguing against some of the abuses that were forming of the Catholic Church. So he fought against the Pope's authority over the Church of England, and one of his key doctrines that he kind of adds to the mix is the sufficiency of Scripture, where the Pope was starting to mingle in a lot of things, and the Pope was elevating himself pretty much to the level of Scripture by this point. What the Pope says goes. Wycliffe was pushing against that, saying no human has that authority. Scripture alone has the authority. And he was an early adopter too. At this point, the Bible was only in Latin. Every town maybe had one or two, and you'd have to go to Mass in Latin and just somehow understood what they were saying. Wycliffe translated the Bible into English. He also developed ideas around justification being by faith alone, which dudes like Martin Luther would pick up on his teaching later on. And he really fought against the Catholic system of justification by faith and works. Funny enough for Wycliffe, he dies a peaceful death, but later on in life, or later on, the Catholic Church deems his teachings heretical. And so to really show that he was a bad guy, they dig up his bones, they burn them, and then toss them in the river. They kind of excommunicate him posthumously. They really got him with that one. And later on, there's a story of 7 of Wycliffe's followers were burned at the stake for just teaching their kids the Lord's Prayer in English. So, the church was at a pretty bad state at this point. Finally, a guy called Jan Hus, he was Czech, and he was based in Prague, and he came after Wycliffe, and he picked up on his teachings. He kind of carried the torch on, and he started to really go at indulgences, which he saw as useless. He thought, if God himself freely forgives all our sin, and Christ has done all the work, then why are we even talking about these indulgences? And we would agree, right? They're useless when we understand what Jesus has done. He fought against the Pope. He said, hey, you're not the head of the church. Christ is the head of the church. And he kind of, if you look at the difference, if you go to a Catholic church, the Eucharist will be right in the middle. If you come to a church like a Protestant church, preaching is often kind of emphasized as the main part of the service. And those ideas start to develop through Hus, which become a Reformation ideal. Last slide. Hus was pretty controversial, and he was called by the Catholic Church to defend his views. And he said, okay, I'll do it, but promise me a fair trial, right? And they said, yeah. And they get there, they chuck him straight in prison. They put him before a kangaroo court. The court's already decided. And they, at the Council of Constance, and they burn him at the stake. And his final words were, I shall die with joy today in the faith of the gospel which I have preached. And where we'll finish up with today. Today you are roasting a goose, but in a century there will arise a swan that will prove unable to cook or roast. Some of his final words. And next session, we'll pick up exactly 100 years later, pretty much exactly 100 years later, with Martin Luther. Perfect. Thank you.